Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to move this for a second. It is really good to see you. To my right and to the middle and to my left. It's really good to see you. So, you've already gathered my name is Susannah. If you're new here, that's my name. If you're old here, you'll recognize me. I serve on the leadership here, and one of my roles is teacher, Sunday morning teacher. And there's a team of us who rotate bringing the message on a Sunday morning and who support each other in staying aligned with the Word, with the Holy Spirit, with each other and as a community. So I'm part of that team. And a few years ago, just to remind us, we embarked on a journey of going through every book of the Bible. So we finished the Old Testament, and we've spent the last year and a half in the New Testament, specifically in the New Testament Gospels. So now we find ourselves in a series called Face to Face with Jesus. Face to Face with Jesus. And what we're doing is we're studying close encounters people had in real time with Jesus, and as recorded in specifically Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This month, if you remember, if you were here at the beginning of the month, Johanna talked to us about Jesus and the Roman centurion. Okay, and then just last week, Perla talked to us about Jesus and blind Bartimaeus. So we've had a couple of characters come up, and we've looked at how Jesus has responded to them, and they to him. You'll have noticed in announcements, I just felt it's worth kind of mentioning before we go any further, that our church puts a lot of emphasis on not just hearing the word, but responding. And so Brittany described how next Sunday we're going to get together in small groups and we're going to talk about these messages, because it's really important that we take the time and space to let God speak to us personally from the passage that we studied. And we're in the middle of like a season at our church where he's really moving and speaking. And I just wanted to like kind of say that from the get-go here. Like, I'm standing here just humbled and honored because I know Jesus has been moving, and he's going to move this morning. And what we want to do with this story is, okay, it's a good story. It makes us feel good things about Jesus. But what we want to do is remember that the Jesus in the story is like here in the room right now. And the things that he did in the story, he's going to do today. And so when we hear, oh, it's a series on face-to-face encounters with Jesus, what that means is you are invited into a face-to-face encounter with Jesus after you hear the story. And specifically on my heart this morning, and it'll make sense when you hear the story, but there's something for you if you're a parent this morning or in a parental figure position. And there's something for you if your child or the child that you look after is not okay. And there's something for you if you're not okay because of what is happening to your child. Okay? And I wanted to just speak that out over you and start to build that faith and start to offer that invitation to you. There's something for you if you're a parent or parental figure in this room and you're not okay or your child is not okay. And I believe during worship he said it's expanded to just anyone with family members who are struggling and you're struggling to see them struggle. And so there's something for you in the story, and he wants to meet with you this morning. So what is the story? Well, it is Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy. And it's found in Mark and Matthew and Luke, but Mark has like the most juicy details, so we're going to actually land in Mark today. And my approach is to simply like take us through the story and kind of enter into some of the details of the encounter so we better understand who Jesus shows us, how Jesus shows us the character of God. To build faith through that story, to prepare our hearts for what he's going to do in ministry time, and to really just, the more that we understand who Jesus is, the easier it is to have faith in him, right? So this story is just about you learning about the character of Jesus, which is the character of God. All eyes on him. And as I prepared, it seemed natural to kind of break this story into 4 parts, kind of like 4 chapters, and to notice what is happening in each part. So the parts are on the mountain, on the ground, the encounter, and the debrief. Make sense? So we'll start on the mountain, we'll move to the ground, we'll look at the encounter, and then there's this debrief at the end. Everybody okay with the 4 parts? All right, so before we even get into the 4 parts, you need to understand the context that we're in the final months now of Jesus' life, his ministry. Actually, just prior to what we're going to read, the passage in Mark, he is recorded as predicting his own death and arrest and resurrection. For the first of 3 times, he did this to his friends. And the disciples heard that, and they didn't really fully get the reference. But what I'm sure was happening was they were starting to feel like that kind of rising stress. You know, when you say, okay, the stakes are higher, we're obviously moving towards some sort of intense showdown or intense event. And so just kind of put yourself in that position, the final weeks before Jesus' death, those feelings of higher stakes, tension, and stress. And I'm sure Jesus was feeling that too. So that's the larger context. And so as things are ramping up, let's look at part 1. We'll pick up on part 1, which is on the mountain. Now, part 1 takes place before our story starts, our story about the demon-possessed boy. And we need to know what happened on the mountain because it helps us appreciate how Jesus shows up on the ground. It's an event called the Transfiguration. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of the Transfiguration? Not transubstantiation, but Transfiguration, okay? So what happens in that story? Jesus hikes up a mountain. It's called Mount Tabor. It's in Lower Galilee, which is in northern Israel, for the geography geeks. And he takes Peter, James, and John with him. Peter, James, and John are like his inner circle. These are his closest friends. And at the top of the mountain, they watch as he's transformed into this radiant figure. And he's joined by Moses, like the Moses from the Old Testament, and Elijah, and they have a conversation about his mission. And the boys are watching the whole thing. And then the Father's voice speaks words of affirmation over Jesus, much like he did at the baptism. And the whole incident is celebrating and confirming Jesus' identity, his purpose, how he's fulfilling the law. That's Moses. He's fulfilling the prophets. That's Elijah. And this is a very strengthening moment for Jesus. And it's a faith-building moment for his closest friends. They get to kind of experience this transfiguration. Actually, much later in a letter to the church, Peter, who was there, he describes to the people he's writing to, this is after Jesus has gone back to heaven, he describes how they were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So it really stuck with Peter. And he just talks about how when they were with him on the holy mountain, this experience he had. And just behind me, I've listed some of the key words and phrases from that passage, just to kind of capture the vibe for you. So look, high mountain, they're by themselves, they're all alone. Here's some of the description of what happens to Jesus. There's glory, there's a glory cloud. You have these ancient leaders of Israel present. You have God speaking, I love Jesus. This is my son, I am pleased with Jesus. Listen to Jesus. So all of that is happening in part 1, all right? Now, as we head down to part 2, back down the mountain, let's just catch up with the other fellows and ladies on the ground who didn't get a chance to go up the mountain. So, the rest of the group were not involved in the transfiguration, but they had other things to worry about while it was happening. So I imagine what happened was, Jacobo, you can stay back on that other slide, that they had set up camp at the base of the mountain, and that many other people had followed them. At this point, they always have some people tagging along, a lot of people tagging along, including a few different characters that are going to come up in our story. So Jesus is up in the mountain. The rest of the crew is down on this base camp. And here's what happens. Let's start the story at this point. Jesus just had this experience. The scene on the ground is set up, and he's coming down into part 2. So here we go. This is the beginning of Mark 9:14. When Jesus, Peter, and James, and John returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of the law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. What is all this arguing about? Jesus asked. Let's pause for a second. Can you take some time to just imagine with me Jesus' experience moving from what I just described in part 1 to this mayhem on the ground? I imagine like he could still hear his Father's voice in his ears, right? Maybe he felt the warmth of like Moses and Elijah's like hand on his shoulder and back. Maybe even the air around him still feels a little shimmery, right? And here's Jesus, and I love to picture Jesus in these scenarios. Down he comes, right? Down the path, closer and closer to the bottom, and boom, the fallen world like rears up in his face. Yeah? And that's how It is for him. And it's a difficult contrast, right? That would have been difficult. And there's a slide, Jacobo, if you could turn to that, that has a list of key words and phrases for what's happening on the ground. So we've got where they were alone and only a few of them, there was a large crowd. People, teachers of the law, disciples, surrounding, arguing, onlookers are growing. And then there's a few details there that we'll get to. There's some not so nice stuff going on. But what's Jesus' response? I was watching to see what he would do. Well, he asks a question. And that question to me signals that he actually wants to engage, right? He could have come down and been like, nope, not today. Bypass, went straight back to, I don't know, a quiet place by the pond nearby, right? He actually steps into that mayhem and he says, what's all this arguing about? He's opening up the conversation. He's ready to engage. And I wanted to just encourage us, like, that's how he's approaching your situation this morning, right? You might think, oh, Jesus, you don't want to be troubled with this, whatever excuse you have in your mind or, profile of Jesus you've created. But actually, he's right here ready to step in to the mess. Yeah? What's all this arguing about? Tell me more. Let's keep going. One of the men in the crowd spoke and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever this spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and he grinds his teeth and he becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Let's pause again. Now we have a little bit fuller of a picture, right? The religious leaders have arrived at some point to the base camp. Why are they there? Why are they there? Well, they want ammunition in their case against Jesus, right? They're looking for anything that might undermine his integrity. And happy day. They witnessed Jesus' followers attempt some deliverance ministry for someone in the youth group, right? And nothing happens. And it's probably likely that they actually got a pretty nasty reaction, right, inside the body of that boy. And so the religious leaders jump on this epic fail, and clearly they're starting to cross-examine the disciples, and now the crowd, oh yeah, they're starting to get involved as spectators, right? It would have been interesting to see the deliverance. It's even more interesting to see it fail, and then to see them start fighting, and we can watch the whole thing, right? And if I was a disciple, I know I would be feeling, well, how would you be feeling if you were a disciple at this moment, starting to get questioned by the religious leaders coming off a failed deliverance? Doubtful, embarrassed, defensive, what else? Anxious, yep. All of these human emotions. I would have been feeling all of these things that not only did my efforts backfire, but Jesus is off site, of course. We can't, there's no cell phones back then. It's not like they can text and be like, get down here right now. We need you. So this heightened emotional state, what you're feeling from the story is probably what they're feeling. And it's likely why they were provoked then into an argument with the religious leaders, right? An argument you're never going to win. So what happens next? Let's keep reading. Jesus said to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you?" And I like the Message translation. He says, "What a generation. No sense of God. How many times do I have to go over these things? How much longer do I have to put up with this?" Here's an emotional reaction from Jesus, right? It's good to see him feeling his feelings, right? And it's kind of one of those things that comes out of Jesus' mouth, and you really need to understand the context to hear the tone of it and to hear really the message behind it. So as an English teacher, the first thing I notice is that he's asking rhetorical questions. Anyone remember from English class what's the point of a rhetorical question? Anna?
Really like how they're feeling, but you're not actually.
Right. So he's revealing us something about himself and his views, but rhetorical questions aren't meant to be answered. You're right, Anna. They're meant to actually make a point or they draw attention to something. And it seems to me, instead of like berating the disciples, like, get over here, how long do I have to talk to you guys about this? It's kind of like a sweeping question that's like sent out over this whole unruly crowd in front of him. And they represent the kind of wider culture in society, right? And what's he saying with the questions? Well, in the first few minutes on the ground, I think Jesus has connected the dots, right? The focus and energy, he can tell straight away, has shifted from the kingdom coming, right, to two groups fighting over who's right and who's to blame, and then you've got this circle of people around relishing the drama. Yeah? And the power of God has been reduced to a formula, right, that apparently is broken. And the boy and his father, this is the most important bit, the boy and his father are forgotten. Do you see what happened? Where are the boy and his father? They're not the focus anymore. And who is benefiting from this show? Even deeper than that, I would say the enemy is benefiting, right? The demon inside the boy is like, this is exactly what I like to see, right? And who's suffering the most? Yeah, the vulnerable, the victim, the voiceless. And that is the very demographic that Jesus has been preaching, that God prioritizes and that the good news is for. All right. So I also particularly felt for the boy's father in this moment. I mean, the disappointment, right? Not just that some good folks he had heard could be of help weren't able to help, but these are ministers on behalf of like the Messiah, right? Who have now revealed their own insecurity and their own immaturity. They're squabbling, disappointing. And so for these reasons, Jesus is bothered. And for these reasons, he doesn't keep rebuking or even start teaching. For those same reasons, he is responding to what he sees as happened. He's bothered, but he also does something. He doesn't keep rebuking. He doesn't start teaching and get his finger out. What does he do instead? Well, let's look at part 3, the encounter. Keep going. This is what he says straight after that. Bring the boy to me. Focus is back on the boy. Bring the boy to me. So they brought the boy. But when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. What do you mean if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. Let's pause again. So there are so many different elements here again. And I just picture what's happening to the boy. I mean, it talked about how the demon had taken away his ability to hear and speak. So imagine the hell of that. Imagine all of that happening in your body, and you can't say anything, and you can't hear anything. And the utter, violence and grotesque cruelty of it, right? And it just made me think of that verse in Ephesians 6. It talks about, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So what is inside of him is real. What's happening is real. There are spiritual forces that this boy is dealing with, and they are in operation today with one goal, and you'll see it happening to the boy, to destroy and distort the image of God in a person. To destroy and distort the image of God in humans. That's heavy. Then I watched the demon sense the presence of Jesus. And he freaks out. It is bent on destroying the boy's life until it comes up against God, bent on saving his life. And I hear compassion in Jesus' inquiry. It's like his tone has changed now that he's dealing with the Father. He asks kind of, how long? He's curious about the condition. He's getting close. He wants to hear the backstory. And then when he repeats the words of the man back to him, I don't think it's one of those, what do you mean if I can? Or, what do you mean if I can? Right? I think I tried to read it with some warmth there. I think it's almost like a little bit of a twinkle in his eye. Like, what do you mean, if I can? Right? And he's moved to focus, right, of that whole hubbub back onto the needs of the family. It's firmly focused on the needs of the family and back onto belief in himself, right? Now he's centered everything around him, his heart, what he's doing, and what the problem is in front of him. So what is he really saying to that man? Like, again, that's one of those things that comes out of Jesus' mouth. You're like, ugh, like, what does that actually mean? I think he's just saying, there are no ifs with me. Amen. Right? Amen. My friend, there are no ifs with me. Do you accept that? And then essentially saying, and anyone who accepts that will then approach me with a very natural faith and expectation, right? And anything can happen because I make impossible things possible. Anything can happen because I make anything happen. Anything can happen not because you believe anything can happen or you're involved in making anything happen. Anything can happen because I make everything happen. I am everything, right? And so let's see what happens when he gives the father that. The father instantly cried out. We can go to the next slide, Jacobo. I do believe. Like, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. So he's recognizing within himself what we all recognize is, yeah, that's why I brought the boy. Like, you have to understand, I do believe. Help me, because he heard himself say that if, right? It slipped out before he could catch it. If he can, and Jesus is responding with what I just explained. And so he says, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. When Jesus saw that the crowd of onlookers was growing, again, he's not happy with this turning into a scene it's not supposed to be. He rebuked the evil spirit. Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak, he said, I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again. Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as people said, oh, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. I actually really appreciated this detail. Like, the boy's been rid of the demon, but he's totally wrecked. Can you imagine what he might look like on the ground? But Jesus' power isn't limited to just the deliverance moment, right? He restores the boy to life. He pulls him symbolically back on his feet again, and he's working against that sentiment, circling the whole thing of hopelessness and unbelief in the crowd, who are so ready to be like, oh, isn't that amazing, but look, he's dead, right? And we know now the boy could hear again, and he could speak again fully now, and I'm sure the first things he heard were something that Jesus said to him. This is what Jesus does. This is who Jesus is. Here's the fourth and final part, the debrief. Afterward, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, why couldn't we cast out that evil spirit? And Jesus replied, this kind can only be cast out by prayer. And sometimes fasting. There's a translation that also includes fasting. I don't know about you guys, but I love the fact that they came to Jesus to troubleshoot. Like, they felt safe enough to be like, hey, can we talk to you about earlier? And I've been learning to do that more. And I would encourage anyone in this room to find themselves in this story, in this moment here. Like, hey, if things are not going well, if you feel like you're caught in a rut or something's off, like, troubleshoot with Jesus. He's welcoming you into that space as well, to learn with him. And when I first read this, I wondered whether he was talking about like a special kind of prayer or a certain length of fast that you need to pray, or if you have to be in a certain condition or a level of holiness to kind of see these things work out. But the more I sat with it, and I sat with the other three parts of the story, I realized what he's just talking about here is being in like a dynamic relationship with God. Like, if we think about prayer, I think about when he taught these guys to pray, right? How did he teach them to pray? Our Father who is in heaven, we honor your name. So if you're in that kind of relationship with God where you're continually reminding yourselves of his glory, his honor, his power, like your kingdom come, your prayers are about the kingdom coming, your prayers are about God's will being done. You're in a relationship with God. I believe what happened with the disciples was probably like, we know they had been sent out by twos and they had been very successful when Jesus first kind of commissioned and anointed them to do the things he was doing. But something had kind of like gotten lost by the time they got to this point. And I believe that they were not operating with that kind of full focus on God, right? It had either they had turned to doing a formulaic prayer or it become slightly religious where they thought if we do this in the morning, we'll see this in the afternoon, right? They were missing that kind of alignment, that intimacy, that deep attachment to Jesus. And I also just thought, well, the Lord taught them to pray, but also we know that he only did what he saw the Father doing. So again, what he's saying to them is, prayer is what I do. I spend time with my Father and I listen for what he wants to do and I partner with him to do it. And so it's an encouragement to not make our faith or make our ministries routine or religious in any way, but to keep your eyes on the power of Jesus, the person of Jesus, what he can and wants to do, not on your own abilities. And so it's not these, there's this prayer up there you have to know to do deliverance. It's a lifestyle. It's a dynamic relationship with God where you're being led by him to do the things that he wants to do and only he can do. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. There's, I don't know if anyone is familiar with N.T. Wright. He's a theologian. We're coming into land. Anyone know N.T. Wright? British writer or theologian, wonderful, wonderful person. And he has a commentary on this passage, and he describes kind of what I was just going for as, imagine it's a full moon at night, right? And you have a window, but it's not facing the moon. So you're looking at the window, and you don't see anything because your window is not facing the full moon. Now imagine you've got a very small slit in the wall on the other side of the house, and you're looking through the slit, and you can see the moon, right? And what matters is not the size of the window, right? What matters is, are you facing in the right direction? Are you facing the right person? Are you looking at the light? And so it's just kind of capturing, like, it's not about the size of your faith and your ministry. It's like, are you focusing on Jesus Christ? Because even if you're just a little bit focused or have that little bit of faith, on the other side of it is something so big and inexhaustible, it doesn't matter about the size of your faith. That makes it possible as long as you're looking to him, looking for him, looking with him. And so enough faith isn't about generating something within yourself, right? Or like trying to manifest possibilities, right? Enough faith is about facing in the right direction, looking at the right person. That, and Jacob, if you go to the next slide, in, I think it's Matthew, instead of them recording him saying it comes out only by prayer, he says that because you're not taking God seriously is his response. If you had a mere kernel of faith, then there would be nothing you wouldn't be able to tackle. And again, it's not, find within yourself that faith. It's, if you have a little bit of faith and it has the name of Jesus on it, that is possibilities. That can do something, right? And so he's just firmly focusing this whole situation back on himself and faith in himself, right? So here's where I want to land. I want to land on that line. Bring the boy to Jesus. So I can invite Brittany to come up, who will be leading us in ministry time, and Johanna to get ready. And I'll let Brittany explain what we feel like is on God's heart this morning. But I wanted to land my portion here with this sentence, right? Bring the boy to me. And I started by kind of a shout out to any parents or parental figures in the room or family members who are not okay or who have a child or a person they're in charge of or care for that is not okay. And that this is for you this morning, this direct invitation from Jesus to bring the boy to me. And you can fill in the blank. It might not be a boy. It might be a grown daughter. It might be a cousin. It might be a little girl. You know, and Jesus knows what can be in that blank. And I'm going to end my part and hand it to Brittany with that invitation. Here's where we want to land from this story and where we want to have that face-to-face encounter with Jesus right now. Here's what he's saying to you. Bring the boy to me.